I screwed up. There's no other way to put it. I stood there, champagne flute in hand, watching my husband storm out of the country club ballroom, his face a mask of hurt and anger. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the uncomfortable coughs and whispers of the other guests. And it was all my fault. Let me back up a bit. My name is Evelyn Rees, and I'm what most people would call a successful woman. I'm a real estate investor with a portfolio worth millions, a corner office with a view of the Chicago skyline, and a reputation for being a shark in stilettos. I close deals that make grown men cry and come out on top every time. Or at least I thought I did. You see, my father always told me that control is power and power is everything. Evie, he'd say, is as hard as steel. In this world, you're either the hammer or the nail. Make damn sure you're the hammer. And I listened. Oh, how I listened. I married James right out of college. He was sweet, stable and supportive. Everything my father wasn't. James was content with his job as a Mercedes sales manager, happy to come home at a reasonable hour and putter around in the kitchen. He loved to cook, always trying out new recipes and insisting on family dinners. At first I found it charming. Later it became an inconvenience. As my career took off, I spent less and less time at home. Missed dinners turned into missed recitals and little league games. Our kids, Emma and Ethan, grew up with a father who cheered from the sidelines and a mother who sent congratulatory texts from business meetings. I told myself it was fine. They had James. I was providing for the family, securing our future. What did it matter if I wasn't there for every little thing? But tonight, I crossed a line I can't uncross. It was the annual Real Estate Investors Gala, a black-tie affair where deals are made and reputations are cemented. I'd been working for months to land the waterfront project, a massive development that would put my name on the map forever. The deal was almost closed. I just needed to schmooze a bit more to show that I had the right connections. James was by my side, looking dashing in his tuxedo. He'd taken the day off work to be there, even though I knew he hated these events. As we mingled, I could see him getting more and more uncomfortable. He was out of his element, surrounded by shark-like smiles and conversations dripping with subtext. That's when I saw him, Robert Caldwell, the final investor I needed to greenlight the waterfront project. He was heading our way and I knew this was my chance. I plastered on my most dazzling smile and turned to make introductions. Robert, so glad you could make it. I'd like you to meet my husband, James. Robert's eyes flicked to James, then back to me. Ah yes, the little woman's better half. What is it you do again, Jim? I saw James stiffen slightly at the dismissive turn. It's James, actually. I'm in auto sales. I managed it. I cut him off with a laugh that sounded forced, even to my emirs. Oh, James is our resident chef. You should taste his cockleven. Tell me, Robert, have you had a chance to look over the projections for Phase 2? I steered the conversation back to business, effectively shutting James out. I could feel him retreating into himself, but I pressed on. The deal was so close I could taste it. As Robert and I delved deeper into profit margins and zoning laws, I barely noticed James excusing himself. It wasn't until I heard the telltale clink of a fork against glass that I realized he was standing at the small stage at the front of the room. Excuse me, everyone. I'd like to propose a toast. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to my husband. I felt a flicker of annoyance. What was he doing? James' eyes found mine in the crowd, and I saw something there I'd never seen before, a mixture of hurt and defiance. To my wife, Evelyn Rees, the most driven, ambitious woman I know, she's so dedicated to her work that she's missed our daughter's last 3 piano recitals, our son's championship game, and our last 2 wedding anniversaries. But hey, at least she's here tonight, right? Silence in the room was palpable. I stood there frozen as James continued. You know, when we first met, Evelyn used to say that what she loved most about me was how I could make a house feel like a home. Funny how things change. These days, I'm lucky if she remembers which house is ours. He raised his glass, his smile bitter. To Evelyn Rees, a woman who has it all except for the things that really matter. With that, he downed his champagne in one gulp and strode out of the ballroom, leaving me standing there, mortified and shell-shocked. And that's where we came in, me watching my husband walk out on me in front of Chicago's real estate delight, the deal I'd been chasing suddenly feeling hollow and meaningless. As the moment started up around me, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. Shame. Pure, unadulterated shame. Not for my professional conduct, but for who I'd become as a wife, as a mother, as a human being. I mumbled some excuse to Robert and rushed out after James, my heels clicking on the marble floor. But by the time I made it to the parking lot, this car was already pulling away, leaving me alone under the harsh glow of the streetlights. I stood there, the cool night air raising goosebumps on my bare arms, and for the first time in years I let myself cry. Not the calculated tears I'd used to close deals or manipulate situations, but real gut-wrenching sobs that left me gasping for air. What had I done? How had I let it come to this? As I fumbled for my phone to call a car, I realized with a jolt that I couldn't remember the last time I'd had a real conversation with my children. Emma was 14 now, or was she 15? And Ethan, he must be around 12. The fact that I had to think about it made me feel sick. The ride home was a blur. I kept replaying James' words in my head, each one hitting like a physical blow. When had I become this person, this cold, calculating machine who valued deals over family, who saw her own husband as nothing more than a prop to be trotted out at social functions? As the car pulled up to our house, a sprawling mansion in the suburbs that I'd insisted on buying despite James' protests that it was too big, I saw that all the lights were off. Of course they were, it was past midnight. My family was asleep, and I was coming home from a party where I humiliated the man I promised to love and cherish. I kicked off my heels the moment I stepped inside, the house occurring with an emptiness that had nothing to do with its size. Making my way upstairs, I paused outside Emma's room. The door was plastered with posters of bands I didn't recognize and a calendar marked with events I'd missed. Gently, I pushed the door open. Emma was curled up in bed, her long dark hair spilling across the pillow. She looked so young, so vulnerable. I wanted to go to her to smooth her hair back and kiss her forehead like I used to when she was little. But I didn't, I'd lost that right somewhere along the way. Next was Ethan's room. His door was ajar and I could see him sprawled out, one leg hanging off the bed, surrounded by sports equipment and discarded comic books. There was a trophy on his desk that I'd never seen before. Little League MVP. When had that happened? Why hadn't I known? Finally, I came to our bedroom. James was there, his back to me, his breathing too, even to be natural. He was awake, pretending to be asleep to avoid talking to me. I couldn't blame him. I changed quickly and slipped into bed, maintaining the careful distance that had grown between us over the years. As I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, the full weight of what I'd done, not just tonight but over years, came crushing down on me. I'd sacrificed my family on the altar of success, convinced that I was doing it for them. But what good was a big house and a fat bank account if there was no love, no connection, no real family to share it with? Something had to change. I had to change. But how? I'd spent so long being the hammer, I wasn't sure I remembered how to be anything else. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the curtains, I made a decision. I didn't know how, but I was going to fix this. I had to. Because for the first time in years, I was facing a truth I couldn't negotiate or strong-arm my way out of. Evelyn Rees, the woman who had everything, was on the verge of losing it all. The next morning I woke up to an empty bed. The space beside me was cold, James long gone. I lay there for a moment, the events of the previous night washing over me in waves of shame and regret. The silence in the house was oppressive, broken only by the faint sounds of movement downstairs. I dragged myself out of bed, foregoing my usual morning routine of checking emails and market reports. Instead, I threw on a robe and made my way downstairs, following the sounds of life to the kitchen. James was there, his back to me as he stood at the stove. The familiar sight of him cooking breakfast hit me like a punch to the gut. How many mornings had I rushed past this scene, too busy with my phone calls and meetings to appreciate the simple act of a loved one making a meal. Emma and Ethan were at the table, heads bent over their phones. They didn't look up as I entered, and the realization that my presence didn't even register as noteworthy to my own children was like a knife twisting in my chest. "Good morning," I said, my voice sounding small and uncertain in the large kitchen. James turned slightly, his face a mask of polite indifference. "There's coffee in the pot," he said, before turning back to the stove. Emma and Ethan mumbled their good mornings, eyes never leaving their screens. I poured myself a cup of coffee, the familiar routine feeling suddenly foreign. As I stood there, clutching my mug like a lifeline, I realized I didn't know what to do next. This was my family in my home, and I felt like an intruder. "I hadn't had any meetings this morning," I said, trying to sound casual. "I thought maybe we could have breakfast together." The silence that followed was deafening. Emma and Ethan exchanged a look I couldn't decipher, James' shoulders tense visibly. "Since when do you eat breakfast?" Ethan asked, his tone a mixture of surprise and suspicion. The question stung, mostly because it was justified. When was the last time I'd sat down for a family breakfast? I couldn't remember. "I thought it might be nice," I said lamely, feeling more out of my depth by the second. James placed plates in front of the kids, then set 2 more at the table. "Sit down, Evelyn," he said, his tone neutral. "The eggs are almost ready." I sat, feeling awkward and out of place in my own kitchen. Emma and Ethan put their phones away. A house rule I vaguely remembered agreeing to but had never enforced. James joined us, placing a platter of scrambled eggs in the center of the table. The silence as we began to eat was uncomfortable. I racked my brain for something to say, anything to break this awful tension. "So, how's school going?" I asked, wincing internally at how cliché and disconnected I sounded. Emma raised an eyebrow. "It's summer, Mom. School's been out for 2 weeks. "Oh," I said, feeling my face flush. "Right, of course I knew that." Another silence fell. I took a bite of eggs, surprised by how good they tasted. Had James' cooking always been this delicious, or had I just never taken the time to notice? "These eggs are amazing, James," I said, offering a small smile. He nodded, his expression unreadable. "Thanks, it's a new recipe I've been working on." "New?" Ethan piped up. "Dad's been making these for like a month now." I felt my smile falter. A month. I'd been eating takeout at my desk or protein bars on the go, while my family had been enjoying home-cooked meals together. Meals I hadn't even known about. "Evelyn," James said, his voice carefully controlled. "Don't you have that big meeting about the waterfront project today?" I blinked, momentarily confused. The waterfront project. The deal I'd been so focused on. The reason for last night's gala. It felt like a lifetime ago. "I am going to reschedule it," I said, making a decision on the spot. "I think I need to take a day off." The look of shock on my family's faces would have been comical if it wasn't so heartbreaking. "Are you feeling okay, Mom?" Emma asked, genuine concern in her voice. "You never take days off." The fact that my own daughter found it more plausible that I was ill than simply wanting to spend time with my family hit me like a physical blow. "I'm fine, sweetheart," I said, fighting back tears. I think it's time I started making some changes." James studied me for a long moment, his expression a mixture of skepticism and something else I couldn't quite read. Hope maybe, or was that just wishful thinking on my part? "What kind of changes?" he asked cautiously. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. I've been a terrible wife and mother," I said, my voice shaking. "I've put my work before all of you and so sorry. I want to do better. I need to do better. I don't expect you to forgive me right away, but I'm hoping you'll give me a chance to try and make things right." The silence that followed my confession was heavy with years of neglect and missed opportunities. I held my breath, waiting for anyone to say something. It was Ethan who broke the silence. "Does this mean you'll come to my games now?" he asked, a mix of hope and eeriness in his young face. I felt my heart constrict. "Yes, sweetie, I promise I'll be there." "Even if you have a big meeting?" Emma chimed in, her tone challenging. I met her gaze, seeing years of disappointment reflected in her eyes. "Even then," I said firmly, "you're more important than any meeting." James cleared his throat, drawing my attention. His expression was guarded, but I could see a flicker of something in his eyes. Not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps a willingness to see where this might go. "It's not going to be easy, Evelyn," he said quietly. You can't just decide to change overnight and expect everything to be fixed. I nodded, feeling a lump form in my throat. I know, I whispered, but I have to try. I can't keep going like this. I don't want to. For a moment. We all sat there, the weight of years of neglect and the tentative hope for change hanging in the air between us. Then slowly, James reached across the table and took my hand in his. It was a small gesture, but in that moment it meant everything. Okay, he said softly, let's see where this goes. As I looked around at my family, really looked at them, perhaps for the first time in years, I felt a mixture of regret for all the time I'd wasted in determination to do better. It wasn't going to be easy. Years of damage couldn't be undone overnight. As I sat there, holding my husband's hand and meeting the cautiously hopeful gazes of my children, I knew that this moment, this connection was worth more than any deal I'd ever closed. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time in years I felt like I was finally heading in the right direction. The next few weeks were challenging, to say the least. Trying to rebuild relationships I neglected for years, while simultaneously attempting to disentangle myself from the all-consuming world of high-stakes real estate, was like trying to defuse a bomb while juggling chainsaws. But I was determined to make it work. My first order of business was to start seeing a therapist. Dr. Amelia Chin came highly recommended, known for her no-nonsense approach to family counseling. Our first session was eye-opening, to say the least. So Evelyn, Dr. Chin said, peering at me over her glasses, tell me why you're here. I launched into an explanation of recent events, talking about the gala, James' public call-out, and my sudden realization that I'd been neglecting my family. Dr. Chin listened patiently, her face impassive. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair. Evelyn, do you know what I hear when you tell me this story? I shook my head, bracing myself. I hear a woman who's been running so hard and so fast that she's completely lost sight of why she started running in the first place. Her words hit me like a ton of bricks. She was right, of course. Somewhere along the line, I'd forgotten that the whole point of building a successful career was to provide a good life for my family. Instead, I'd turned that success into an end unto itself, sacrificing the very people I was supposed to be doing it all for. Your father's advice about being the hammer instead of the nail, Dr. Chun continued, it's a common mindset in high-pressure careers. But tell me, Evelyn, how has that worked out for your personal relationships? I felt a lump form in my throat. Not well, I admitted. Dr. Chen nodded. Control might be useful in business, but relationships, especially family relationships, thrive on trust, vulnerability, and mutual support. You can't control your way into a loving family dynamic. Over the next few sessions, Dr. Chun helped me unpack years of ingrained behaviors and thought patterns. We talked about my relationship with my father, how his teachings had shaped my worldview, and how I could start to reshape that view to be more conducive to healthy relationships. One particularly grueling session focused on my need for control and how it stemmed from a deep-seated fear of vulnerability. Evelyn, Dr. Chin said, her voice gentle but firm, what's the worst thing that could happen if you let go of control for a bit? If you allowed yourself to be vulnerable with your family? I felt my chest tighten at the mere thought. They could reject me, I whispered, voicing a fear I hadn't even known I had. They could decide they're better off without me. Dr. Chen leaned forward. And if that happened, would it be any worse than the distance that already exists between you? Her question left me speechless. She was right, of course. In my efforts to maintain control and avoid vulnerability, I created the very situation I was most afraid of. Armed with these insights, I began the slow, often painful process of reconnecting with my family. I started small, making a point to be home for dinner every night. At first, these meals were awkward affairs, filled with stilted conversation and long silences. But slowly, things began to change. I remember one night, about 2 weeks into this new routine, I was helping James clear the table when I accidentally dropped a plate, sending shards of ceramic skittering across the kitchen floor. Shit, I muttered, immediately dropping to my knees to clean up the mess. I'm sorry, I'll replace it. James knelt beside me, gently taking the broken pieces from my hands. Hey, he said softly, it's just a plate. Are you okay? You didn't cut yourself, did you? I looked up at him, surprised by the concern in his voice. For a moment, I was transported back to our early days of marriage, when a simple act of kindness like this was the norm rather than the exception. "I'm fine," I said, feeling tears prick at my eyes. I'm not very good at this, am I?" James' expression softened. "At breaking plates?" "I'd say you're pretty proficient," he joked, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. I couldn't help but laugh, even as tears spilled down my cheeks. No act of being here, being present, being a wife and a mother. James was quiet for a moment, his hand resting on my shoulder. "You're trying," he said finally, "that counts for a lot." We finished cleaning up the broken plate in companionable silence. As we worked, I felt something shift between us. A tiny crack in the wall of resentment and hurt that had built up over the years. That night, as we got ready for bed, I made a decision. "James," I said, my voice shaky, "I want to show you something." I went to my closet and pulled out a small battered shoebox. Inside were mementos I collected over the years. Ticket stubs from Ethan's first baseball game, programs from Emma's piano recitals, anniversary cards from James that I'd never responded to but couldn't bring myself to throw away. "I kept these," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "All of them. Even when I couldn't be there, I wanted to be. I didn't know how." James sat down beside me on the bed, looking through the contents of the box with a mix of surprise and something that looked a lot like hope. "Why are you showing me this now?" he asked. I took a deep breath. "Because I'm trying to be vulnerable," I said, Dr. Chen's words echoing my mind. "Because I want you to know that even when I was at my worst, even when I was most absent, you and the kids were always on my mind. I got so caught up in trying to provide for you all that I forgot how to actually be there for you." James was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing over a faded crayon drawing Ethan had made years ago. Finally he looked up at me, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "Thank you for showing me this," he said softly. "Yet it helps to know you cared, even if you didn't always show it." It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. The next big hurdle came in the form of Emma's piano recital. It was a Wednesday afternoon, smack in the middle of what would normally be my busiest time at work. But I'd made a promise and I was determined to keep it. I arrived at the school auditorium 20 minutes early, my heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. As I took my seat, I couldn't help but notice the surprised looks from the other parents. Clearly, my absence at these events hadn't gone unnoticed. When Emma took the stage, I felt my breath catch in my throat. When had my little girl grown into this poised young woman? She looked nervous as she sat down at the piano, her eyes scanning the audience. When she spotted me, her eyes widened in surprise, then lit up with a smile that made my heart ache. As she began to play, a complex piece by Chopin that I didn't even know she could handle, I found myself overwhelmed with emotion, pride, joy, and a deep aching regret for all the moments like this that I'd missed. After the recital, I waited for Emma by the stage, a bouquet of flowers in my hands. When she saw me, she hesitated for a moment before rushing into my arms. "You came," she whispered, her voice muffled against my shoulder. "Of course I did, sweetheart," I said, holding her tight. "I'm so sorry it took me so long. You were amazing up there." As we pulled apart, I saw James and Ethan approaching, both looking slightly wary as if unsure how to navigate this new dynamic. "Hey, rockstar," James said, pulling Emma into a hug. "You killed it up there." "Thanks, Dad," Emma beamed before turning to Ethan. "Even you have to admit that was pretty cool, right?" Ethan rolled his eyes, but I could see the pride in his face. Yeah, you're a regular Mozart or whatever." As we all laughed at Ethan's feigned indifference, I felt a warmth in my chest that I hadn't experienced in years. This, I realized, was what I'd been missing all along. This connection, this sense of belonging. "How about we go out for ice cream to celebrate?" I suggested, the words feeling foreign but right on my tongue. The look of shock on my family's faces would have been comical if it wasn't so heartbreaking. "Don't you have to get back to work?" Ethan asked, his tone a mixture of hope and disbelief. I shook my head, smiling. "Not today. Today, I'm all yours." As we left the auditorium together, Emma's hand in mine and James' arm around my waist, I knew that no business deal, no amount of money could ever compare to this feeling. I still had a long way to go, a lot of trust to rebuild and wounds to heal. But for the first time in years I felt like I was exactly where I needed to be. The road to rebuilding my relationships with my family was far from smooth. There were setbacks, moments of frustration, and times when old habits threatened to resurface. But slowly, surely, things began to change. One of the biggest challenges was learning to delegate at work. I'd always prided myself on being hands-on with every aspect of my business. But if I was going to make real changes in my life, something had to give. I remember sitting in my office, staring at the mountain of paperwork on my desk and feeling overwhelmed. That's when Sarah, my assistant of 5 years, knocked on the door. "Evelyn? Is everything okay? You look a little frazzled." I let out a bitter laugh. "Frazzled doesn't begin to cover it, Sarah. I'm trying to be home more, to be there for my family, but the work just keeps piling up. I don't know how to do both." Sarah was quiet for a moment, then said something that changed everything. "You know, Evelyn, you hired a team of incredibly competent people. Maybe it's time you let us do our jobs." Her words hit me like a ton of bricks. She was right, of course. I had a team of skilled professionals, all of whom I personally vetted and hired. Yet I'd never truly let them take on the responsibility they were capable of handling. "You're right," I said, feeling a weight lift off my shoulders. "You're absolutely right. Sarah, I need your help. Can you gather the team for a meeting? I think it's time for some changes around here." Over the next few weeks, I worked on delegating tasks and responsibilities. It wasn't easy. Letting go of control never is, but it was necessary. I had to trust my team to believe in the people I'd chosen to work with. As I learned to step back at work, I found more time and energy to invest in my family. It was a delicate balance, and there were days when I felt like I was failing at everything. But I kept at it, reminding myself that progress, not perfection, was the goal. One Saturday morning, about 2 months into this new chapter of my life, I found myself in the kitchen with Ethan. He was making pancakes, apparently a skill he'd picked up from James, and I was attempting to help. "Mom, you're doing it wrong," Ethan said, watching me struggle with the batter. "You're stirring it too much. It'll make the pancakes tough." I felt a flash of irritation, my old need for control rearing its ugly head. But then I caught myself. This wasn't about being the best at everything. This was about connecting with my son. "Okay, chef," I said, handing him the whisk. "Show me how it's done." Ethan's face lit up as he took over, explaining the finer points of pancake batter consistency with all the seriousness of a master chef. As I watched him work, I felt a surge of pride and love so strong it almost took my breath away. "When did you get so good at this?" I asked, genuinely curious. Ethan shrugged, but I could see the pleased smile on his face.